8 is really a number that most bands would like to get to as far as the album count is concerned. It's something that they would, I guess, thrive if they were able to get that far into their careers. There's a lot of bands that don't make it to 5. A lot of bands that barely make it to 6. Fewer make it to 8, and rarely do you see 10 or more. Well, Iron Maiden in their first 7 albums had really experienced a run that was almost inconceivable. It was that of legend. It's crazy. However, their first album, the 1990s, entitled No Prayer for the Dying, actually was the first taste of, well, one could say non-success. And the funny thing is that non-success for this particular band is something that really could be considered to be wild success to another. So it can kind of show you where the plateau necessarily is that this band has been on. Now, of course, as album reviewers, sometimes whenever we encounter legendary releases or just releases that are damn strong, we kind of come up with this whole idea of the the effect that you have to have in order to try to follow it up. Every single band that has ever had a top 5 album on your album of the year list really suffers from this particular fate. How exactly are they going to be able to match what they were able to achieve on their previous record while still evolving their sound and still remaining unique, viable, and good? Well, that's with one album. Iron Maiden had been strongly building one great album after the other now for 7 straight. The bar had never been set higher, especially after Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, which was a landmark release that really blended their traditional new wave of British heavy metal style along with the subtle art of progressive metal that Seventh Son really used to help exhibit its story and its structure and its dynamic grace. So basically, the album that I find to be the best Iron Maiden album, how could you top it? No Prayer for the Dying was the attempt, and it was a 10-track affair that clocked in at 45 minutes long. Now, this isn't necessarily going into a longer era of album, such as we saw with the album that came after this one, Fear of the Dark, and especially throughout the band's albums after that. However, for 44 minutes and 2 seconds, this album seemed to be lacking something. And whenever you take a look at the rundown of songs, the biggest issue that you can definitely see is really memorable songs. Now, Tail Gunner is a song that barely made it to the Ed Hunter disc, if I were to recall correctly. And the only other one that really had any sort of, well, name value would, of course, be Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. This is a song that was originally penned by Bruce Dickinson for a movie soundtrack, something that he used in his solo career, and he also brought over to Iron Maiden for this particular album. Now, what's interesting is that the versions between his solo effort of this song and the actual song that you get on this Iron Maiden album are 2 completely different entities, which is kind of unique. However, at the same time, Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter actually was a #1 hit, which is very unique to say on an album that really didn't exactly have the strength of all of the others. Now, another thing that I will claim and I will say is that whenever you listen to this album again with an open mind, if you kind of ignore what all of the people that are around you say and kind of formulate your own opinion, you'll notice that actually this album isn't really all that bad. However, the biggest reason why I think this album catches as much flack as it does is because, well, the 1990s were an era for Iron Maiden where they kind of went a little commercial, so to speak. Either that, or it could be said that many of the ideas that they allowed slip through the cracks and make it to the final album cut maybe should have been tweaked a little bit more. Either that, or should have been potentially swept underneath the table into the B-Sides collection. It's really something that depends upon your particular perspective. For me, this particular album, whenever you listen to it after, I guess you would say, many, many months of non-listen, it's an album that actually strikes you as somewhat good. It actually has a lot of redeeming factors. You can kind of see the transition that Iron Maiden was making towards the 1990s, where they kind of take the progressive side that they sampled from Seventh Son of the Seventh Son and kind of tweaked with it a little bit and added a little bit of a commercial twist of lemon. What you actually get is over-experimentation, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but for a band like this that had a die-hard sound and a dedicated following of fans, the residual effect was just a lot of discontent amongst the Iron Maiden faithful. To be fair, the title track is actually a song that you could see the direction where the band would be taking in the 2000s a little bit, just by the guitar tone and by the structure of the song overall. Fate's Warning is, of course, a song that many people will recall because they'll immediately think about the band of the same name that had been around for some 5 years prior to this album being released. But then there's the songs that you won't remember. Songs such as Hooks in You or Run Silent, Run Deep. Public Enema #1 you may remember only because of its title. A lot of these songs just really don't bear the same value. They don't really bear the same acclaim as the songs that you heard prior to this. So, for that reason and that reason alone, this album is oftentimes much maligned by the Iron Maiden faithful, and I tend to kind of follow around that logic a little bit as well, only with a little bit more of an open mind. Whereas for a lot of people this is probably a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10, I actually give this about a 7.25. For having a lot of songs that you really don't remember in the long run, a lot of things that you would really ignore, and surprises that perhaps you would forget. The album's not terrible, but the album definitely was a far cry from their predecessors at the time. An interesting thing before I go and move on to the next album review is this. When comparing the songs on the new album that's about to come out, The Final Frontier, many people said that a certain track on there is close to being as bad as Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. I don't get this. I don't think Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter is a bad song at all. Apparently purists do, though. If you can explain this to me, please do. I like the song. Why don't you? Anyway, stay tuned. There's only one album left in the Bruce Dickinson first era, which means that the glory days seem to be coming to an end. Or are they? Stay tuned to the next album review and find out.